Thank you, Dr. Williams. Ms. Haywood, Mr. Medford, members of the board. The previous discussion was a good segue to really talk about school safety and security, and I want to thank you for that because I think it's going to move nicely into what we need to talk about. When I started to put together this presentation, I thought about safe schools. What's out there about characteristics of safe schools? This information comes from the State Centers for Safe Schools. We have one in Virginia, and I'll talk about that later. But this has also been adopted by the U.S. Department of Education, Justice, Health, and Human Services in that Safe and Drug-Free Schools program. So what are the characteristics, the components you need to have in place, first of all, to have a safe school or safe school division? Number one, strong leadership. Principals, school board members, teachers, parents. It takes everyone to really focus on, and I can tell by this discussion tonight that we are focusing on all the other components that don't normally come to surface immediately when you talk about school safety. But these are some things that we need to talk about. High academic standards. It's been proven that you have a better climate in high-performing schools than you do low-performing schools. Your strategic plan speaks to that. The work we've done since I've been employed in the school division has always been about excellence and moving things forward in the school division. You know, that goes with our reputation because we are a high-performing school district that helps with safety. Also, involving the community. Those discussions, we now have a plan about family engagement. That's going to, I think, give us dividends as we move forward. We're making everyone, making perhaps a real strong term, but engaging everyone and making sure that we have the kind of environment, culture in our schools that we're going to need to move us forward. And this also talks about including good relationships with law enforcement. As you know, we've said and you've seen that we have an outstanding relationship with the York County Sheriff's Office, no doubt. Something that you talked about earlier, you used the exact words, making sure the kids don't fall through the cracks. What are the services? What can we put into place? As you can tell from the previous discussion, we're challenged in this area because of resources. But I can tell you, and Dr. Pentecost's department and Dr. Jones' department, school admin, I've never seen so many conversations between the two departments involving the counselors, the school psychologists, and with Mr. Dillon and Dr. Jones and the principals about what's the issue and how do we work through it and what kind of resources do we have available in the school division to address this issue. It's not unusual weekly now, Dr. Pentecost, I can tell you, for those departments to actually connect to work through a situation involving the student. And it may be involving law enforcement. It may involve social services. It just depends on the issue and that child. But I can tell you a lot of time is now spent working through those issues, especially since Sandy Hook. Not that that's a bad thing, but this is where we are right now. Comprehensive strategies. I think someone used that term earlier. Students do have concerns and needs, emotionally and developmentally. Again, the staff is working very hard. Teachers, students, parents. It's not unusual for us to get referrals from students about something they heard or something they thought. You know, you may remember an incident recently where a parent called to report something that their child had received via Instagram. See, it's that kind of communication, recognizing all the issues out there that we need to then connect all the resources, even if it is law enforcement, to address a concern or to address an issue. Are we still challenging that? Yes. But I think sometimes now we've gotten past where kids don't tell. It used to be kids didn't tell. But now, and I'm pleased in the fact that they do tell things. Because if you hear it, if you don't think it's right, tell someone, and then we will address that. Safety plans. You have to have a safety plan, and you have to evaluate it and use the latest research on effective programs. We do a lot of that through training. I know Mr. Medford is a big proponent of going to the safety conference in Hampton every year. Low cost, I think it's $50 registration fee, and there's a lot of national speakers come in and they talk to us about latest issues involving school safety, involving children. What do we expect? What kind of items can you go to the local drugstore or even the 7-Eleven or a convenience store? What kind of items are there that students regularly buy? And what are some of the issues that he's seen nationally? I can remember this one slogan, Mr. Medford, and you may remember it. That was a police officer from Detroit. He stood 6'9", and his website is Tall Cop Says Stop. It's kind of catchy for him to do that.
All cops that stop.
Right, that's his website. But he's in the community and he sees the kind of things that are occurring in the community, so he was able to report us those kinds of issues. When he came here, matter of fact, he went to a convenience store, not far from the Hampton Convention Center, and the number of items that he could purchase within a half a mile of that facility that kids are abusing. See, it's that kind of information, that kind of training that we need, so we are aware of those kind of issues. And again, training. Training on both sides, operational, discipline, counseling, instruction. It has to be a comprehensive package if we're going to continue to make our schools safe. So I think all of these characteristics here really speak to what it takes to make our schools safe, to make them effective, so we can have the kind of schools that we need. Any questions before I move on?
Well, you talk about that and you talk about drugs, and I know from what I have been seeing recently with disciplinary issues in the schools, and I look over transcripts, and it seems like things are going smoothly through elementary school, 6th grade, maybe 7th, 8th grade, 9th grade, it's just gone. So what do you do to prevent that from happening? What do you do to prevent the kids from falling through the cracks? Is there a way to identify, I don't know, that may be the impossible question.
Right. I don't know whether there's one method that's going to work, but I am a believer in the fact that we have to provide kids the vehicles to self-report or to report on their peers. We also need to make staff very aware of issues, concerns facing those students and what some of the symptoms are when a student should go in the wrong direction. But it's a constant process, I believe. And as you talked about earlier, it's a matter of resources. So you have people in place to actually address all these issues, because I can tell you the landscape is changing.
And it's an example of where the student-teacher ratio is important, where teachers are establishing those positive, respectful, caring relationships that can be a difference in motivating an individual student who, for example, the middle school level, starts to struggle. The counselor-student ratio is another related resource that helps address and try to minimize the number of students who go from being successful as elementary students to struggling in middle school and hitting a wall in high school, perhaps.
And I think the other piece I'm going to add, family and communities, because in elementary school, and I think we've all been there, you're so involved in elementary school. You go to everything, you're volunteering and so forth. You get to middle school and you see folks back off a little bit and not be as involved. And by the time they get to high school, I'm not saying this is all situations, but you're having some situations where school can't get a hold of parents all the time. So if we can just keep our parents as involved and active in our schools as the students get older, would be wonderful.
That's a problem, but some of that you just can't. You go to lunch with your kids, you read with your kids when they're in elementary school, and then middle school, there aren't as many opportunities. In high school,
They don't want you there.
They don't want you
Yeah,
there.
or go visit, pop in. I don't know. And maybe how do we make it more conducive?
I think, school climate, building climate, I'm not sure what the answer is, but the climate in a school has, I think, everything to do with what kids think are cool and what their peers are going to think is cool. And so, creating that type of climate, and all the schools are going to have a different climate, so it may just be at the ground level there. Be a good conversation to go back to.
Hey, good discussion. Involvement of public safety agencies. We talked about this earlier. How are we involved with law enforcement and the other agencies out there? Since Sandy Hook, I can tell you it really has increased, and I'm really pleased to be able to call Lieutenant Hahn, and we get immediate action from him and from law enforcement. Now we have random patrols and visits at the middle schools, elementary schools, and the school board office. They may drop in, they may sit in the parking lot to complete reports. They may actually have lunch sometimes, especially several of our officers, of course, live in the county. They have children in our schools, so they have a veteran interest, so they will come into the schools from time to time. But we want that to become part of our culture, that they're there and they actually come in and become known to the teachers, the students, and the administration. I don't see anything wrong with that. Also, law enforcement will check the doors at our schools just to see if they're locked. We also have division staff that will do the same thing, because we've invested a lot of resources in the access control system, but are we actually using it? Are we going back to the old method of propping the door open? I think we've come well beyond that point now, but it's nothing, I believe, wrong with checking those doors just to make sure they are locked. Something I think we have here that's a national model That's our intruder drills, our lockdown drills. The coordination with law enforcement and deputies volunteering on their off schedule to participate in those lockdown drills. I can tell you, we had one a couple of weeks ago, and we had a neighboring school division actually come in to observe it and see the kind of feedback and what actually happened in that drill. And they were really impressed with the feedback and the discussions with law enforcement and the principal and the teachers in that school. They said, never seen anything like that happen before. But that was really outstanding. And I think we have a national model there. And that leads me into this post-drill review and assessment. After every lockdown drill, they actually sit down and they do a hot wash, I'll call it, of that drill. What went right, what was wrong, were all the doors locked, what did you notice, hallways clear, and those issues are addressed when someone is not in the right place, when they're not doing the right time. Because we've done a lot of training in that area, so now we actually need to practice. I can tell you, it makes my heart feel good when students, you may remember the situation at Dare a couple of weeks ago at night, and some of the younger children said to their parents, no, mommy, during a lockdown, we do this and we do that. We don't just walk out of the door.
Out of the mouth of babes, right?
I mean, that's absolutely phenomenal for that to happen. Also, the communication piece. As you know, we have the 800 megahertz radio system, where if the phones are out, emails out, with that radio, you can communicate to central office, you can communicate with law enforcement, and you can communicate instantly to 911 using that system. One thing Dr. Jones does when she comes in the morning, she'll turn on her radio, and she keeps it on all day, because sometimes the principal will communicate on that radio if they don't have phones, so see who's listening. Also with that 800 megahertz radio, the first Monday of every month, the secretary or someone from the school will do a radio check, and then Tammy Doherty and maintenance is going to record the fact that, yes, someone did call and that radio is working, because we want to make sure they're working. And you also know that all of our buses are equipped with that radio. So if there's something happening on a bus, they can very quickly get in touch with dispatch, with the transportation office, or right to 911 if need be, instantaneously. We don't have to wait for, pull off the road and get a cell phone. They have that 800 megahertz radio right there in every bus. And with that, we're also able to communicate a safety message to all of our bus drivers. Anytime we need to, we can actually communicate to them. Also, you know, our buses have the GPS system, so it's easy to know where they are at any point in time. So that also helps us to ensure that our buses are doing what they need to do and they're where they are supposed to be. Also, something we do, the state requires us to have our plans reviewed, and then that's reported to the state every fall, but they're also reviewed by law enforcement to make sure our practice would be consistent with the practice of law enforcement. And also something that's very important here is incident command, because should something happen at the school, we go into incident command procedures. Who's speaking for which organization, who's actually, if I use the terminology, who's running the show, and then how we coordinate those pieces. So that's part of our training we have for staff on incident command. This also involves fire and life safety, because that could be an issue if there's a fire in the building. I remember Ms. Kirsty was at Grafton one afternoon when we had it, and she actually had an opportunity to see what happens when the fire trucks come, when the kids are outside, and the kind of communication that goes on whenever we are in that particular situation.
It was very impressive.
I can tell you every fire drill now, not every fire drill. Some of the fire drills, someone from Fire and Life Safety is going to come there to observe the activities outside of that school during a fire drill. We're required by the state to have one monthly, but someone's going to come to actually see what's happening, so we'll coordinate those dates. What they want to see is, hear the kids, what if I had a major incident in this side of the building? And we need to bring the ladder truck. If you bring the ladder truck, you're going to need quite a bit of room to actually anchor that truck and then start to use it. So where are the kids? So we need to make sure that we understand when major equipment comes to a school in an incident, then where the children need to be and the other things we need to do. So that's just part of the training and coordination, collaboration with law enforcement and fire and life safety that keeps us moving forward. Professional development, I talked about that earlier, but fire and life safety, law enforcement, I've talked about that. Social services, I spoke about earlier, how key that is to us now and making sure we can do everything that we possibly can to know that our children are safe. I spoke about the annual Virginia School Safety Conference. That's fortunate for us. It's been at the Hampton Convention Center, I think, now for the last 5 or 6 years. So that's easy access. We can get there. Most often, Mr. Medford will go. Sometimes I'll go. This Department of School Administration will go, and sometimes principals will go, just to hear the latest information on school safety. Because there's a lot of things that this past summer that I wasn't aware of until I went to that particular conference. So that's really important for us to keep our schools safe, to keep our kids safe.
Yeah, that conference is a gift. I mean, if y'all ever wanted to attend it, it's really inexpensive, but it's a 3-day conference. Of course, I'd do it for in-service, but the information, the national speakers, I mean, they'll have 700-800 participants that show up from all over the state, to include administrators, I mean, superintendents, all the way up to, down to principals and teachers and school security officers. And it's just it's a hodgepodge mix of just a lot of different people that come out with a lot of good information.
When is it usually
Yeah, I
held?
was going to
It's
ask.
in August. It's
First week in August.
first week in August. Normally it's the 5th, 6th, and 7th, I think, this year.
Let us know.
Yeah,
Keep it-
Monday,
That
Tuesday,
sounds like it's fascinating
It is, really is.
It's a really, they do a really good job.
in my next job.
Your next job. Okay. I can say that law enforcement, I think, was it last week, Mr. Manford, or the week before that, Lieutenant Hahn and someone from law enforcement went to the western part of the state for a safety conference that was put on by the Department of Criminal Justice. But recently, they actually went to that, because that's important for law enforcement, our school resource officers, as well as it is for school people to actually go to those kinds of events. I talked about the plan review and certification earlier. Something you may not be aware of. The state is still moving forward with us, providing direction and leadership on things that we need to be aware of in our schools. Starting this year, even right now, our 7th and 8th graders, each school, they're participating in the Virginia Secondary School Climate Survey. And it's going to address teachers' perception of the school, rules and discipline, teacher and student relationships, student engagement in the school, and the extent of bullying or teasing in the school. So this year, they're going to do grades 7 and 8. Next spring, they're going to do grades 9 through 12. And this is done by the state through the Department of Criminal Justice, just to help school divisions with identifying what some of the outline issues, or underlying issues rather, may be for a school. I'll be interested to see
Will
those
we
results.
receive the results?
Absolutely. I don't know how it's going to be packaged, but I don't know for sure, but I feel certain we'll get the division scores as well as the state scores. So when that information comes back,
The
we'll share
verdict's
it.
still out on how they're going to process that and disseminate it, because it's being done by the Department of Criminal Justice Services. So,
Right. Right. I don't know if they'll publish it in their annual book that you get the year after the data was collected, just how soon it comes, I don't know. But I know we are participating in that now in our middle schools. Next year, as I said, that'll be in the high schools. Some of the division initiatives. The format and technology of terminology in the crisis management plan, that's now very consistent. When we say lockdown, it's the same in every school. Because if we're working with law enforcement and we use the term lockdown and they're coming into the school, they have an expectation for lockdown. So there has to be the same expectation regardless of the school. So that now becomes standardized. Through last year's strategic plan, we reported on positive relationship among students. And this also includes bullying. Dr. Pennicuff referenced bullying. And we know that's a national issue, but we are trying to address that. Video surveillance. Our secondary schools have video surveillance. Our SROs now have a monitoring stations in each school. Recently, we've connected the schools. So an SRO in school A can view footage in school B. And that may be an advantage to law enforcement. For 5 years now, maybe this is the 5th year, right, that we've had access controls with the Aiphones. That's becoming the national thing, but we did that 5 or 6 years ago. Photo visitor badges. Now when you come into a school, as some of you may know, when you sign in, your picture is taken and you get a badge with today's date on it. So you can't use it tomorrow because it's dated and your picture is there. So that's been very important. Dr. Pennicuff talked earlier about threat assessment protocols and procedures, about how we work through that when a threat has been made, and what level is it, and what kind of resources do we need to bring to bear, or are there significant disciplinary issues? And that's something that we do consistently whenever there is a potential threat or a threat made in a school. Some other things that are done, something that's going on now for a number of years, and this is through student services. I think Valerie Wilson coordinates this, the nonviolent crisis intervention training. When students need to be redirected and staff needs to intervene, what's the appropriate way to do that? We want to de-escalate situations, not escalate them. So this training helps staff know how to work through those situations with students and not try to escalate it, but to actually de-escalate it. We've had standardized interior door locking procedures. One of the things you do in a lockdown is very quickly lock your door. So we want procedures in place so they're standardized across the division. The methodology may vary because of the locking mechanism on the door, but the expectation is that we can quickly do that. Monitoring of buildings by schools-based staff. I know Ms. Kursky talked about the planning periods earlier, but we want people to be aware of anything that seems different today in a school. I can remember when I was a principal, there's a certain level, and I may use the term noise, that's okay. When it gets beyond that, now your focus needs to change. So you need to be aware of that, our staff needs to be aware of that, because each school has a climate and a culture, and you get a certain hum through the school each day. That's okay. But when it goes beyond that, then you need to pay attention to why has it now changed. And that's one of the important things about having staff out there to monitor to see what's happening now. Is this different than what I would expect to have in this school?
What would an example be when you're talking about a certain level and then what would escalate?
Okay, in the lunch blocks.
Okay,
Kids are talking loudly, but no one's yelling and screaming.
at each other, so fights. All of a
Right.
sudden you're having more fights
Or
or
you
something.
see a lot of kids move quickly to a certain area. Why did students here move quickly to this area to my left? There's a reason they did that. Why? So we need to know why they moved. So
Gotcha.
that constant vigilance out there. And also, what I believe when I was a principal some years ago, something I call building up a bank of trust with students. So they trusted me, I knew them. In case I needed to subtract from that bank account of trust, we had a relationship, so it became much easier. So you have to be out there, you have to know the kids, and they have to know you. Because sometimes when students are misbehaving, they're not as focused as they should be. So when you call their name, you want them to recognize you, recognize your voice, and then respond to that. So that's an important thing to have. If they don't know you, if you're not a part of that culture, if you're not out there being involved, then that makes a difference. I also believe in a school, kids move from one end of the building to the other. If staff's monitoring the student movement, they're going to be more orderly when they get to class. If no one's monitoring and things happen along the way, then when they get to class, they're not going to be as focused. So it takes the entire school as students move through to make sure things are quieter. And that's basically in the high schools and middle schools, of course, elementaries, they're constantly monitored because they keep them on the right side of the hallway, right?
Yeah.
Whenever they're moving. But in secondary schools, it's just a little bit different. So you have to be aware of that.
This raises a point. When we look at new hires and transfers, internal transfers from teacher to AP to principal, we've had things that y'all have looked for and have worked really well. But this is kind of a new element, in terms of being aware of things around you, having that relationship perhaps with the kids, and not everybody is well equipped for that. So it may be going forward that adds a whole new dimension in terms of what we look for in staff members, at every level. So just an observation.
Okay, division hotline, we've had that for, if I would guess, 10 years or more now. Facility improvements. Since Sandy Hook, believe this or not, Grafton Bethel Elementary School had cafeteria doors that didn't have locks on it. They now have locks. You couldn't lock the cafeteria. At Bethel Manor, the panic bars, because the gym was added on, the panic bars were there as if that were the end of a hallway, which means you could push that and get into the cafeteria. Now they've been reversed. You can push them to get out into the hallway, but you can't get in as easily. So those are the kind of things that were immediately brought to our attention by principals, and they're not afraid to let us know that we need this taken care of. So some of those things we've been able to do. There are many more things we'd like to do, but that's just one example. Dr. Jones last year established a division safety committee that meets periodically with principals to share their concerns about safety. And this spring, since we developed the family engagement, part of the strategic plan, she's established a family engagement committee. And they meet and they developed some of the strategies that we have for the strategic plan. And I think next week, Dr. Jones is going to go to the Family Engagement Conference in Lynchburg next
Super.
week. So that's also been a big focus for us, how to engage, as the discussion earlier talked about, we need to engage the families about what are the ways that we really need to work on engaging the families.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that.
Righty.
Okay. That's all I have right
Fantastic.
now. Any questions? for
I
me?
enjoyed that. Anything
great.
else?
Thank you.
It's very beneficial for the community to hear this. You know, it's got to be comforting for parents and communities alike to see the things that we're putting in place and have in place, no doubt.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. James.